Hi, welcome back. We're going to begin the second section of our lecture on teaching doctrine. And here I have Peter, who certainly needed to be reminded of some truths at the lakeshore at the end of, after Jesus had risen, he needed to be reminded that Jesus still loved him. But he really took seriously this ministry of reminding, and you see him here saying that he's going to remind them, and he intends to keep on reminding them, even though they know them already. So you kind of think, well, why then? Why do you need to keep reminding them, though they know them already? Well, maybe it's a little like how we still like to hear our spouse or our friends say that they love us. He says it's right. Our memories need refreshing. And so he wants to arouse their intention. He's equipping them to remember, not just to know these things, but also to remember, calling on this truth from Deuteronomy and other places in Scripture that we see that remembering is an active spiritual discipline. It's not just a feat of memory that we're able to call numbers to mind, but that we have cultivated this practice of being a people with active, good theological memories. So Peter is trying to build that into his people. Catechesis is ongoing was one of the mottos of one of my favorite theological professors. We're never done, partly because there's always new people, we hope, coming into our churches, and because there are always fresh situations in which theology needs to be applied, and because we're forgetful people. And so catechesis is ongoing. We're never done with this ministry of reminding. And Lancelot Andrewes, the great preacher to the court of the king in the 1500s, said that in the office of preaching we are employed as much about recognosce as about cognosce, that we are calling to mind the things that people know and have forgotten, just as much as we're teaching them things they've never learned before. And he embraced that ministry. And then P.T. Forsyth, the great preacher from the 1800s, said that the church is built up by the repetition of its own old gospel. And he makes this distinction between novelty and freshness. We're not seeking to be novel and original in the sense of being, as he puts it, absolutely new, but we are seeking to be fresh, to be living. We don't need to be the light, to be the dazzling new thing, but we do need to bear witness to the light. And he says, but don't let that call not to be original sound like I'm justifying dullness in the pulpit. But the cure for pulpit dullness is not brilliance, it's reality. I love that. It is the directness and spontaneity of the common life. The preacher is not to astonish, but to revive. He discovers a mine on the estate. I love that image, that it's very British in terms of the estate, but if you think of it as a large piece of land that everybody's kind of taken for granted for a long time, and then that our task is to discover the gold that's buried right there on the ground that people are just walking over all the time. And then he goes on to say, the church, by the preacher's aid, must realize its own faith, take home anew its own gospel. That which was from the beginning, declare we unto you, that fresh old human nature, that fresh old grace of God. So don't tire of the ministry of reminding, and work hard to tell it freshly. So, and Walker Percy reminds us that our Christian language tends to wear out, and we need to renew our language in order to sing a new song. So how do we do that? How do we tell doctrine in fresh, creative ways, and yet in truthful, faithful ways? Well, one is let me begin to talk with you about how you would teach a doctrine. So when you've settled on the doctrine that you see emerging from your text, Scan a trusted one-volume theological work. I like Stanley Gren's, and there's several good just theological volumes. And you should have not only a collection of commentaries in your library, whether it's digital or paper, but you should have a few good, just solid theological volumes. And if you're a Calvinist and you want to lean into that tradition, that's great. But I would encourage you to have a few from outside your own strict denominational legacy or tradition as well, so that you can catch up on and or recall. You may know this, but you may just need a little reminding about the history of this doctrine. How did it develop, and when did it crystallize for the church? In response to what heresy did it get crystallized for the early church? And then ask yourself, how is this part of what makes Christianity unique? How does this doctrine cause us to differ from prevailing worldviews or from other world religions? And then ask yourself, how is it? So that's part of what builds that freshness in you, is to think, wow, this is actually scandalous. This is really a peculiar truth that we Christians as a peculiar people believe. And then do the work of correlation. How is this doctrine related to the other doctrines? How does eschatology relate to the doctrine of creation or the doctrine of the atonement? And that was one of my assignments in a theology class in my own seminary education, was we had to take a doctrine and then we had to pick any two others and write several paragraphs on how this is informed by this, is informed by this, and how my knowledge of this is richer because I've set it up against two other doctrines. And that is a very good exercise to do. And then ask, what if this one were just missing? What if we dropped this one out? How would our faith be deficient? And why am I so grateful that it is here? So that is moving into our personal reflection on it. So after doing that, some of that more heady theological work, I want to call you to also reflect pastorally and personally and say, how is this doctrine radically good news to me and to my listeners in this week and to the world, given the news that we've been assaulted with this week? For what specific problems and needs in the world and in our lives is this doctrine good medicine, good news? And yet, though it is good news, it will be bad news to some. And why is that? Why does the culture or the world, whatever you want to call the forces and entities outside of the church or God's kingdom, why do they resist or reject this doctrine? And why do I, in the darker places of my own heart, resist and reject it as well? What are the barriers to hearing this doctrine as good news? So that may lead to a time of confession, and it will maybe lead to some sober reflection on that this is maybe a harder task than I thought going to be for proclaiming this doctrine as good news to my people. But it's worth naming those resistances. Then pray your doctrine into your heart. Give thanks for it. Confess to God where you resist it. Do that prayerful work that will prepare you to preach it. So then how do we think homiletically about our doctrine? Well, the first is we need to get a fresh look at it ourselves. And so take a little time to just free write your wonder, your awe at the goodness of this truth. Work on articulating it with a fresh, clear metaphor or an analogy or a simile. Every concept should have a simile, have a, what is this like? And that's where I really recommend in the Thomas Traeger and Leonora Tubbs Tisdale's, a lot of T's there, Traeger Tubbs Tisdale's book. One of the exercises in that book, it sounds kind of funny, but it asks you to actually take a doctrine or a truth from our faith and say, what does it smell like? What does it feel like? What does it look like? What does it taste like? Would it feel like if I felt it on my skin? And I have had students who have actually taken the time to share the work they did. That's not a requirement. But if you do that exercise, I hope you will share it with the rest of us. And I've had some beautiful ones. I'm singed, smelling like just carrying around a backpack worth of rotten food. It's pretty graphic, but students have done that with grace and sin and different doctrines, and they've been really powerful to read. And these are not by students who had considered themselves poets or writers even at all, and so it's really fun to read some of their writing on that. So you can do this, even if you don't think of yourself as a writer. You can come up with metaphors. Just pull them from your daily life. As you're emptying the trash, this is kind of what sin smells like. If you pray for them, they will start to come to you. And then you may need to do the work of clarifying. Just work on, what is this doctrine? How do we miss it? How does the world get so close to it but miss it completely? And what are the dangers if we taught this poorly, that a non-believer could hear this in a way that would be a real stumbling block, or a way that a disciple, a faithful disciple, could hear it, and given a difficult, traumatic background of abuse from a father, or maybe a minority member of your congregation who's really not experienced a judge or as someone who dispenses justice and is on their side. How will I teach about God as judge into this cultural context, or this, how will I teach about God as good father into some of the situations that I know are in my congregation, in the midst of my own people? And so that will get you into that area of what this bad news that can seem like bad news about a doctrine like the judgment of God is surprisingly good news. And then this are just some sentence openers to help you do some writing on applying your truth. So if this is true, what are we then free to do? And you may surprise yourself in the directions that you go with that sentence. If we lived like we really believed this, if our society or our culture, our nation knew this, now there you're doing what a musician, a composition of music would call augmenting the theme. So augmenting a theme, I'm not a musician, but when we I know that when composers take a theme, and then they've got a basic tune, then if they're developing it into a whole symphony, they will sometimes augment it where they double the length of the notes, or they will diminish the theme where they have the length of the notes, but they're still working with the same melody and flow. And so here I'm asking some questions that may in some ways diminish the theme, take it way down to the microcosm of our dining room table on Wednesday. And I'm augmenting the theme by saying, what will that look like in our culture? Or we can do that not just in society, but out in time, and say, what will we be like as people 15 years from now if we pursue this truth, or if we miss this truth? And then another question for just that's diminishing the theme is the 2 a.m. anxiety that our members and we ourselves can deal with, and how this truth is a deep comfort to them in those times. So we see Jesus doing this right and left with themes, and taking a simple situation in ordinary life, like whether or not to pay taxes, and finding a way to teach from there that we are made in the image of God and not in the image of Caesar. And he takes a truth about the love of our Father for us, and then he applies that to not going running after clothes or food. So that is a good ministry, the ministry of actually applying these truths. The couple other resources I want to encourage you to not to neglect are the sacraments. Matters, as my priest friend says. The sacraments are our best possible allies in preaching. They are themselves rich, textured, tangible, shaping metaphors that can instruct us in how to respond to all of life. And so, as preachers of the word, we need as well the symbol and the beauty and the depth and richness of our sacraments. And I recommend to you for that a book by Craig Satterley called Creative Preaching on the Sacraments, and also and Will Willimon has a book on preaching on the sacraments as well, as and of course some of the early church sermons of writers like Ambrose are beautiful, beautiful reflections on the sacraments that you can find in Augustine and Chrysostom, and particularly Ambrose. And then I would also say to trust the seasons. Don't leave the seasons for a sermon series on marriage just because that sounds like a fun thing to do. And remember, even if you are in a very low church tradition, don't forget the church calendar. And they are also just steeped in good doctrine that we can be teaching our people through those seasons. And my final word to you in this area is to invest in your own development as a young theologian, a developing theologian. See yourself as a theologian, even as you step into other roles and begin to see yourself as a preacher and a pastor. See yourself also as a practicing, practical theologian. And theologians need to read. And today, theologians need to go to conferences. Thankfully, we don't need to go to councils and establish doctrines. So maybe in your denomination you have to do a little of that. But don't think of Fuller as this place where you fill your tank and then the rest of your ministry is sort of running that down to empty. I know you don't think that way, but I just want to call you to be sure that you know your own need to be reminded, as we said at the beginning, and to invest in your own development in this area. All right, that will be all for this segment. We'll come back for more soon.